Boldwood presents A Contest to Kill For, written by Evie Hunter and read by Laura Kerman. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Why is it so damn cold? Alexi stamped her Ugg-booted feet on the frosty ground and thrust her hands deeper into the pockets of her sheepskin jacket. It never got this Arctic in London. Stop being such a baby, Cheryl chided. It's only November. Give it a few weeks, and then you'll really have something to complain about. It gets worse than this, Alexi shuddered at the prospect. It only seems warmer in London because of all that pollution. Can't beat an unhealthy dose of carbon monoxide to keep the mercury above freezing. Alexi caught Cheryl's elbow to prevent her from slipping on a patch of ice. Point proven, I believe. Go on, admit it. You like it here. Cheryl nodded towards Alexi's cat. He certainly does. Only because there's more wildlife for him to terrorise. Given some of the sights I saw the last time I was in London, I'd have to disagree. Alexi's breath clouded in front of her face when she chuckled. I guess you have a point. Cosmo, Alexi's cat, trotted ahead of the two friends while Cheryl's little terrier, Toby, danced ecstatically around his feline friend. You'd think they hadn't seen each other for weeks, rather than a couple of days, Cheryl said with an indulgent smile. Cosmo was twice Toby's size and weight, his paw prints in the frost double the size of the dog's. Alexi had been a reporter on the trail of a story that only the derelicts sleeping rough beneath Waterloo arches could help her to break. Cosmo, a feral cat who also resided beneath the arches, had taken a liking to Alexi and allowed her to adopt him. They'd been a double act ever since. You okay? Alexi slowed her pace when she noticed that Cheryl had to scurry to keep up with her. You should have stayed inside with your little bundle of joy. Cheryl grinned at this reference to her 2-month-old daughter. What, and deprived Drew of an excuse to pamper her? Since when did he need an excuse? Cheryl rolled her eyes. Very true. Alexi laughed, thinking of Cheryl's larger-than-life husband and his total absorption with baby Verity. As a first-time father, he was duty-bound to be terrified of dropping her or somehow screwing things up. And yet Drew had yet to put a foot wrong as he dealt with her needs like a seasoned professional. That baby is definitely going to be a daddy's girl, Alexi predicted. Don't I just know it? Cheryl grinned. He even has me... Oh, no. Alexi dropped Cheryl's arm and raced ahead. Cosmo, stop that at once. The film crew guy setting up to record the first session of a reality cooking program at Hopgood Hall had caught Cosmo's attention, and he decided to amuse himself by terrorising him. The man had dropped his equipment, probably something expensive and irreplaceable, and legged it for the nearest door. At the sound of Alexi's voice, Cosmo gave up pursuing him and morphed into a sleek black purring picture of innocence as he twined himself around Alexi's legs. Bad boy, you know better than that. What the hell is that thing? The crew member asked from behind the safety of a closed door. Looks like something out of Africa. Doesn't he, frighten the horses? Sorry about that. He's actually quite harmless, Alexi said, crossing her fingers behind her back. And despite what you might have heard, he's not a Black Panther. He just looks like one and thinks he ought to live up to the rep. Yeah, well, the guy poked his head cautiously around the door and eyed Cosmo dubiously, trying to look as though he hadn't just let a cat freak him out. If he's harmless, I'll put a tenner on the outside in the 1:30 at Kempton Park. Alexi rolled her eyes. This was a horse racing town, and everyone talked the talk. The guy retrieved his equipment, uttered a few more expletives, and disappeared inside the improvised studio. With Cosmo under control again, Alexi returned to Cheryl. Don't be too hard on him, Cheryl said, tears of laughter pouring down her face. It's been a while since he exerted his authority. He'll be the death of me yet. He's only amusing himself. He's like a teenager who gets bored and acts up to get attention. I can see I'll have to keep him clear of this lot. No need. Cheryl flapped a hand. I'll tell them to man up. This is the country. Who could possibly be afraid of a sweet little pussycat? Cheryl dropped a hand to stroke Cosmo's large head. He pushed against her hand and purred like the innocent he most decidedly was not. Brat, Alexi said, failing to keep the affection out of her voice. Alexi cast a critical eye over the building that the film guy had just taken refuge in, still astonished at the speed with which so many changes had taken place in 7 short months. Hopgood Hall was situated in Lambourne, the Valley of the Racehorse. It was a boutique hotel owned by Cheryl and Drew. Alexi and Cheryl had been friends since their university days, but Cheryl had married Drew almost as soon as she graduated with a degree in hotel management, while Alexi headed for a career in journalism. The career that she had put every waking hour into excelling at had come to a spectacular end in the spring when her paper, the Sunday Sentinel, downsized, make that dumb down, and as a serious investigative journalist, she was a casualty of the cutbacks. She and Cosmo came down to Lambourne so she could lick her wounds and decide where to go from there, only to become involved in a missing persons case when a friend of Cheryl's had disappeared. It later transpired that she had been murdered by a local trainer, a man who many around these parts considered to be on par with God. Alexi broke the case with the help of a rather attractive local PI, Jack Maddox. Alexi had subsequently received a hefty advance from a publishing house to write a book about the case. She had taken a cottage in Lambourne and settled into village life, a very quiet location in which to get the book written and decide where to go next. A city girl by nature, she was surprised how easily she had slotted into the whole country scene, and how readily the locals had accepted her. Given that she'd unmasked one of their own as a murderer, she'd half expected to be ostracised. Cheryl and Drew's hotel had been failing when Alexi arrived. The building they were looking at now, constructed from aged brick to match the facade of the lovely old Georgian house, had been an ugly extension of prefabricated buildings to house the grooms working at the yard of the disgraced trainer. At Alexi's suggestion, they turned it into a proper extension with conference facilities and more accommodation. Alexi had gone into partnership with Cheryl and Drew and financed the extension. Drew used his influence to push planning consent through, and the structure had been completed less than a month previously. I can't wait until spring to see how all the little courtyards and landscaping look, Cheryl said. It was clever of you to suggest that Faye did the designs. It gave her a purpose, Alexi replied, referring to the mother of the murder victim, who now lived in her daughter's cottage locally. Come on, let's go inside. I'm dying to see how it all works. Not you, Alexi said, holding up a hand to Cosmo, who meowed indignantly. You've already blotted your copybook. And no nipping at anyone's ankles, okay? Cosmo peered up at Alexi through astute eyes. We won't be long. There'd been a big rush in getting the extension finished so quickly, and now its future hung in the balance. If it was to pay for itself, then this television series would have to show it in a good light and be a success. There was a lot riding on it, and Alexi prayed on a daily basis that she hadn't persuaded Drew and Cheryl to overextend themselves. Following the murder investigation, the hotel's business picked up dramatically for a while. All the ghouls wanting to say that they'd seen the scene of the crime, Drew figured, taking advantage of their, ghoulishness by upping his prices. Alexi took the opportunity to promote the conference facilities, intending to use them for journalism and writing retreats, weddings, and just about anything else they could charge top dollar for. What she didn't make allowance for was her old boss and former lover, Patrick Vaughan, political editor on the Sentinel, coming up trumps. Desperate to get Alexi back, he wasn't taking no for an answer. She agreed to write the odd freelance article for the paper, but made sure she offered pieces to the competition as well. She had a point to make. Patrick kept offering her more and more enticing deals if she'd return to the Sentinel, to London, and to his bed. Alexi wasn't going anywhere. The Sentinel was owned by a mogul who also had interests in a big cable television channel, one that was giving serious competition to the national stations. The channel was filming fly-on-the-wall cookery programmes from 5 different locations in the country, 1 per weekday night from each location for 6 weeks. The regional winners would cook off against one another for the star prize. Patrick heard that one location had problems with the health and safety people, knew of the extension to Hopgood Hall, and sold Alexi on the idea, if the building could be completed on time. Anything was possible, with the incentive of 6 whole weeks of near-full occupancy to spur a hotelier on. Alexi didn't like the idea of being indebted to Patrick, but knew he would be doing it as much for the kudos it would earn him with the boss, pulling the series out of the mire, as to curry favour with her. Patrick always had his eye on the bigger picture. Much as she hated to admit it, Patrick had been right to suggest Cheryl's hotel, and more especially her temperamental chef, Marcel, to star in the production. The hotel was situated in one of the most picturesque villages in the country, where racehorses outnumbered people. The house itself, furnished with lovingly preserved antiques, made a beautiful backdrop. As for Marcel, he could give Gordon Ramsay a run for his money when it came to effing and blinding, except he did it with a French accent that somehow made the profanities sound more exotic. His moodiness and dark good looks made him a natural for the small screen. The camera loved him, and he played up to it like the prima donna that he was. "Do you think they've done their homework on Marcel?" Cheryl asked. "I mean, he looks, sounds and acts French, but you and I both know his roots are in the East End of London, and he's actually a bona fide Cockney." Alexi took a moment to consider the question. "I don't think he's ever actually claimed to be French, just that he grew up in France and trained there, which is true. Everyone just assumes, and he doesn't put them right. Well, in fairness, competition in his sphere is brutal. Anything to gain an edge, I suppose." Cheryl opened the door to the reception area and wiped her feet. Alexi followed suit, knowing it was a waste of time and that their pristine new wood floors would soon be filthy from all the comings and goings. Alexi thought about the obscene amount of money they were being paid to allow the facilities to be abused by the film crew and immediately felt better. "The 4 contestants should be here soon," Alexi said, nodding to the harried producer who was conducting a conversation on his mobile and talking to a man in a suit at the same time. "I can't wait to see what masochistic types would be willing to have every aspect of their lives under scrutiny 24/7 for the next 6 weeks. "They do it on Big Brother." "Yes, but none of our lot will be voted off. They are committed to staying the course, being bullied by our pseudo-French chef, and living with cameras everywhere except in the bathrooms," Alexi shrugged. "I guess you've really got to want to make it as a chef to put up with having no privacy." "Think of our bank balance," Cheryl said, grinning, "and be grateful that we don't have to appear on camera." "Oh, trust me, I am." The friends entered a small reception room, where, in front of the television cameras, the contestants would be introduced to Marcel for the first time. Alexi and Cheryl took chairs out of range of the cameras. Alexi nodded to the guy Cosmo had terrorised and again apologised. "No sweat," he replied, sticking out a hand. "I'm Jerry Salter, sound engineer." Alexi Ellis, co-owner, she shook his hand, and Cheryl Hopgood, the real owner. "Welcome to our little piece of paradise," Cheryl said, taking her turn to shake his hand. "Did I miss it?" Drew came dashing in, carrying Verity across his body in a hooded, thickly quilted pink papoose. She was sleeping peacefully. "Real men aren't afraid to wear pink," he added, grinning when he saw Alexi's shocked look. "How does he do that?" Cheryl demanded to know, cooing over her sleeping child. "She's never this quiet for me." "It's a gift," Drew replied, kissing the end of his wife's nose. "Well, actually, I sing to her. Works every time." Cheryl gaped at him. "You couldn't carry a tune in a bucket," he grinned. "Verity makes allowances." "She would have to." "No, the show hasn't started yet," Alexi said, answering Drew's original question. "No sign of Jack, then?" Drew said. "I thought he might show his face." Alexi shrugged. I'm prepared to say she hoped the same thing. She hadn't seen much of him since they'd tied up Natalie Parker's murder. Not that there was any reason why she should have. There had been a spark between them when they first met, but it had failed to ignite. They'd been out to dinner a few times during the ensuing months, but nothing more. Perhaps Alexi had misread the signs, or someone else had a prior claim on Jack's affections. The possessiveness of his attractive business partner sprang to mind. Probably just as well if nothing came of it, she thought. Since getting her fingers burned with Patrick, she wasn't ready to play the love game again quite yet, even if Jack did tick all the right boxes. Last time I spoke to him, he was tied up on some big investigation in Newbury, Alexi replied. Ah, shame. Hey, gorgeous. What are you doing here? Alexi demanded to know when Patrick stole up to one side of her, slid an arm around her waist and kissed her cheek. She balked at his presumption and pulled away from him. She absolutely didn't need these public displays of affection that made her feel as though he was making some sort of obscure point. Don't you mean thank you for organising all this and making the hotel a fortune? No, I mean, what are you doing here? You run a paper, not a TV show. Thought I might write a piece on the meet and greet stuff myself. Alexi sent him a disbelieving look. That was junior reporter stuff. How the mighty have fallen, she said. Anyway, I'm surprised you got past Cosmo. Ah, I tricked him. Alexi shook off the arm that had worked its way around her waist and waved a finger at him. If you hurt my cat, then you're a dead man, Vaughan. The producer, Evan Southgate, climbed onto the stage and everyone fell quiet. He introduced Marcel to the programme's host, a man by the name of Paul Dakin. He sported a fake tan, heavily lacquered, bouffanted hair, and dazzling white dental implants. Alexi had already had the dubious pleasure of meeting him and disliked him on sight. His plastic charm didn't impress her any more than the smile that failed to reach his eyes. Paul Dakin was his own #1 fan, no question. She actually yawned when he spoke almost entirely about himself for 10 minutes and then failed to interest her in writing a piece on him for the Sentinel. Alexi smiled as Marcel hammed it up for the cameras, banging on about how passionate he was about all things in life, food being just one of them. He'll get all the ladies tuning in, even the ones who hate cooking, Cheryl whispered. The camera really does love him, and the French accent is the perfect touch. I can see why the producers were so keen to have him. Good job you had the sense to tie him into a contract with us, otherwise... Here come the contestants, Alexi said, sitting forward, keen to see what they were like. Details had been closely guarded, and all she knew was that there were 2 men and 2 women. A hush fell over the audience. It was made up of an assortment of crew, suits from Far Reach, the production company Patrick was so keen to make an impression upon, and an array of local bigwigs, including the mayor. Bloody hell! Drew breathed as the first victim, a lady by the name of Juliette Hammond, tottered onto the stage in 4-inch heels and a skirt that could have doubled as a belt, leaving precious little to the imagination. She was hotter than the temperatures generated in Marcel's kitchen, and judging by her confident air, she knew it. There was an audible gasp of appreciation from the entire male audience. Alexi could understand why the men had all sat up and taken notice. The woman was short, stacked, and feminine to her well-manicured fingertips. She had a waterfall of long blonde hair, artfully cascading over one shoulder, and suspiciously green eyes. Odds on she was wearing coloured contacts. Oh, hell, even Alexi was starting to think like a bookie. Alexi forgave Miss Hammond the heavy-handed makeup which was probably necessary for appearing before the cameras. Did that mean the contestants would have to wear makeup all the time, even when they weren't performing? So much for being caught in their downtime looking natural. Juliette's figure was slender yet curvy, and everything about her screamed sex appeal. Even Marcel seemed momentarily speechless, which, in Alexi's experience, was unheard of. "Wonder if she can cook," Cheryl murmured. "Who cares?" one of the crew replied. Greta Reed was Juliette's polar opposite, Tall, overweight, and totally unremarkable. The two male contestants, John Shelton and Anton Heston, were different species as well. Anton had the caramel-coloured skin of a West Indian, with a fine head of dreadlocks and laid-back attitude to go with it. John was short, balding, and on the ugly side of 40. They each did their spiel for the camera, talking about their backgrounds in the catering trade, their love of all things to do with food, and what it would mean to them if they won this leg of the competition. "Heaven help the winner," Drew muttered, aware that he or she was guaranteed a year in Marcel's kitchen, if they could take his temper for that long, learning the trade under his not-so-tender tutelage. The winner of the entire competition would get a big cash reward and an opportunity to feature in a regular TV cooking show. When asked by Dakin what he thought of the competitors, Marcel gave them a contemptuous look, including a preening Juliette in his disdain, and said he would reserve judgment until he found out if any of them could actually cook. If Juliette expected the preferential treatment her looks probably guaranteed her with men, then Alexi reckoned she was in for a disappointment. In her experience, good-looking, charismatic people like Marcel didn't need the competition. Time would tell. Paul reminded them that from now on, they would all be on camera. Everything they said and did would be recorded for posterity, or, more precisely, the edification of the viewing public. With those words ringing in their ears, the producer called "cut" to the live segment. The contestants didn't seem too sure what to do with themselves after that. They milled around, drinking champagne, making small talk, looking apprehensive. "The gloss is already wearing off," Drew muttered. "Don't say that," Cheryl replied. "I'll throttle Marcel if he screws this up for us by being too, well, Marcelish." "He needs this opportunity as much as they do," Alexi said, hoping she was right about that. Alexi's party were about to leave them to it when a screech of protest erupted from the contestants, more specifically from Juliette. "You did that on purpose, you bitch!" she cried, dabbing spilt champagne from her bust. "Sorry," said Greta insincerely. "It was an accident." "Well, just keep away from me. God knows what you're doing here anyway. The camera will make you look like a lump of lard. Don't you have any self-respect?" "Blimey," Cheryl said as she turned with the others towards the main part of the hotel. Cosmo and Toby materialised and escorted them back. "Talk about overreacting. She really seems to love herself. There was absolutely no reason for her to respond so violently to what was obviously an accident." "She likes to be the centre of attention, is my guess," Alexi replied. She had taken a dislike to Juliette. "I'm thinking everything has to be about her. I've met her type more times than enough in my line of work." "At least that lot will be confined in there for the duration," Drew said, jerking a thumb over his shoulder in the direction of the annex. "And we can keep our distance. If Juliette wants to throw a wobbly and insult her fellow contestants, at least we won't have to hear it." "Except it will be caught on camera, I dare say," Cheryl replied. Alexi suspected that with 4 such diverse contestants living and working at close quarters, there were bound to be fireworks. That, of course, was what the television station was counting on to boost their ratings. "Who gets to jump Juliette's bones?" Patrick asked. "Anyone running a book?" "You won't get odds on that," Drew replied. "Marcel decides who wins, so she'll have him in her sights." "Actually, I think she'll go for Paul," Alexi said musingly. "As presenter, he has more influence with far-reach productions. Or Evan, the actual producer, of course. There again, perhaps we're doing her a disservice, and she really is here to prove herself as a cook. The skirt and heels might have been the station's way of vamping up interest." "And my baby might sleep through the night," Cheryl replied, rolling her eyes. "Will you let me buy you lunch?" Patrick asked Alexi in a quiet aside. Alexi hesitated. "Why?" she asked. She had absolutely no desire to have lunch with Patrick, but wondered if there was more to the invitation than a simple desire to get back into her good books. "We need to talk a bit about your upcoming feature," he reminded her. Alexi nodded. The idea for the story came about due to the Natalie Parker case. It transpired that Natalie had been abused by her adoptive father, which had ultimately led to her murder, and had inspired Alexi to delve more deeply into the whole minefield of parental abuse. The article, she thought, was one of her finest pieces, and Patrick agreed with her. The paper's lawyers, though, had reservations. When didn't they? It would be a business lunch then, and you can put it on your generous expense account. Sure, it's business, he replied, looking smug. Chapter 2. Jack Maddox popped the tab on a can of beer, kicked off his shoes, settled back in his recliner, and took a long swallow of his drink. He chuckled as the opening credits rolled and the second week's episode of What's for Dinner filled the screens on primetime cable TV. In spite of the lame name, the programme was already topping the ratings, and he couldn't seem to switch on the telly or open a paper without hearing or reading some fascinating new fact about one of the contestants. He was glad for Cheryl and Drew's sake, and especially Alexi's, even if it galled him to admit that Alexi's ex was responsible for getting Hopgood Hall the lucrative gig. Personal animosities aside, he was at a loss to understand what it was about fly-on-the-wall TV that gripped the nation. Marcel was, Jack conceded, a top-notch chef. He also had charisma by the bucket load, and the camera was his best friend. He shared his disdain for the contestants' efforts equally amongst the four of them. No favouritism in his kitchen. But the scenes featuring him and the sexy blonde outside the workplace were another matter. You could literally sense the chemistry between them. There were lots of touchy-feely moments, and Jack figured the nation had to be taking bets on whether Marcel would be caught sneaking into her bedroom for a private tasting. Marcel's biting criticisms bordered on being downright offensive, and he had almost reduced the other female contestant to tears on several occasions. Why would people put themselves through that much humiliation just for their 15 minutes of fame? They either wanted to make it in the world of culinary excellence really badly, or had their sights set on the celebrity Z-list. In the case of the blonde, it was hard for Jack to decide which. The fact was that Marcel hadn't had to up his game much for the benefit of the cameras. Jack happened to know he treated everyone who worked for him with the same withering contempt. And still all the wannabe chefs in the area flocked to his door every time he had a vacancy to fill. Go figure. When Alexi had got involved with the business side of Cheryl's hotel, Jack had advised her against offering Marcel a contract that included a percentage of the profits. He hadn't been able to give her a valid reason for his doubts, other than that prima donnas were always a pain in the backside to control. He was an inspired chef, no question about that, but he was also temperamental, rude, and arrogant. Jealousy? Jack didn't think so. As far as he was aware, Marcel hadn't tried to hit on Alexi. Not that it was any of Jack's business. He had tried his luck tentatively, but her response had been lukewarm. He figured that was because Alexi was still hung up on her former boss and smarting from the way he'd treated her. She was newly unemployed, had moved away from everything she knew, and promptly stumbled across a murder case that made headlines and shocked the nation. It was enough to unsettle anyone. Jack also wasn't sure if he was in the market for a serious relationship, so had backed off to give her the space that she needed. More space than he had intended. He hadn't seen much of her the past few months. A big industrial espionage case had kept him fully involved before he'd cracked it. But he intended to give her a call when he'd wrapped it up, see if she fancied going out to dinner. Then this latest damned case had reared its head, and for the past 2 weeks he'd been acting as a glorified sales clerk in a jewellery and pawnbroker's shop in central Newbury. He now knew more about earrings, bangles, and the gold price than he'd realised there was to know. The credits rolled at the end of the show, just as his mobile rang. He checked the caller ID and took the call. "Hey, Cass, what's up?" he asked his business partner. "How's my favourite sales assistant?" "What's the difference between a princess and a pear diamond?" "I give up. What's the difference?" "Several £100. Blimey. Just because of the shape? Apparently, Jack sighed. Please tell me that you found something that just might prevent me from dying of boredom. Very possibly. Have I told you lately that I love you? Jack wished the words back the moment they slipped out. Cassie had been a friend to Jack's former wife. When their marriage fell apart, she had wanted to lend Jack more than just a shoulder to cry on. Jack had been happy to join her fledgling PI agency, but wasn't interested in anything other than a business arrangement. Newly single, he was looking for a fresh beginning, having just left his position as a detective with the Met under something of a cloud. On paper, he and Cassie made a good partnership. She was a geek, could hack into just about anything. Jack was a great detective, good at reading people, and with a highly tuned bullshit detector. But Cassie's jealousy had come to the fore when Jack and Alexi worked together on the Natalie Parker case. Jack had told Cassie that he wouldn't be dictated to when it came to his personal life, and they'd had a frank exchange of views on the subject. They now trod on eggshells around one another, studiously avoiding talking about what they did in their downtime. Not that Jack had had too much of that lately. This latest case involved a company that specialised in payday loans, with a head office in Newbury. It was a small organisation trying to make an impression in Berkshire, up against the big boys. The senior partner, Mick Bailey, had called Jack in, complaining that they'd had to cover a lot of bogus loans recently. They'd taken the hit in preference to admitting they'd been conned, but Mick thought that one of the countrywide companies might be screwing with them. Jack doubted that. Cash Out was too small to bother the guys who advertised their questionable practices on national TV. When someone wanted a loan for the first time, they could call into any one of the 20 Cash Out outlets in and around Newbury. They had to supply ID, employment history and so forth, which was sent electronically to Mick's office. They ran a credit check, and within 10 minutes the outlet had a yay or nay. The client was then provided with a laminated photo ID card to encourage repeat custom, and it was game on. The problem was, as Cassie soon discovered because she did it herself, someone had hacked into Mick's database and copied various IDs. People were now popping up at various cash-out facilities, presenting their bogus credentials and getting their loans. Mick had had to cover nearly 20 grand's worth of such loans over a 2-month period. Whoever was doing it was clever and not too greedy. Just a few £100 each time, nothing to raise red flags. They'd also chosen winter to pull the scam, when youngish people wearing hoodies and muffled up against the cold didn't look too much like the pictures on their IDs. Did anyone ever? Jack thought of his own passport photo and how little it actually resembled him, thank God. When it became apparent that something was definitely up, Mick's people put out an email alert to all their outlets, warning them to be extra vigilant. Jack shook his head as he thought about how stupid that had been. If the scammers had hacked into the database, it was kind of obvious that they'd read any email alerts and change their game accordingly. One of the first things that Jack had imposed was an embargo on any online mention of the scam. All future communication with the managers of the outlets would be made by a company rep in person, on the telephone, or better yet, not at all. Businesses loved having meetings, which were often unnecessary and frequently counterproductive. But if word leaked out about cash-out's problems, they could lose customer confidence. If we want to catch the perpetrators, he'd told Mick, we need to let them think we're not onto them. Jack took an in-depth look at the bogus transactions and found that the majority had taken place in the shop he was now working in. Most loans were made at the busiest part of the day, and almost all of them were dealt with by one particular clerk, a guy by the name of Dean Davis. He'd been taken on 3 years ago, straight from school, lived with his mother in a modest house locally, and had no criminal record. He was friendly enough and didn't show any of the nervousness Jack would expect from someone ripping off his employers. He said little about his private life to the other clerks, never mentioned hobbies, a girlfriend, holiday plans, any of the normal stuff the others talked about when it was quiet. He never went for an after-work drink with his colleagues either, always having a handy excuse. No law about being private, but it also seemed a little odd. There again, perhaps Jack had a suspicious mind. Make that definitely. Davies had followed the rules to the letter, and the loans had been made to a raft of different people, none of whom looked suspicious, Jack acknowledged as he trawled through hours' worth of CCTV footage. Davies couldn't be blamed for not smelling a rat. They all had identification that looked kosher. Davies had photocopied them each time he made a loan, which was part of the company's procedure, and there was no way to point the finger at him, yet. Unfortunately, my progress, such as it is, will be insufficient to earn you undying love, Cassie said. All I actually called to say is that I've managed to take a look at Davis's bank account. He spends 2 weeks of each month banking with his local branch, and the other 2 having them bank with him. Jack grinned, amused at Cassie's way of describing the guy's overdraft. So, if he is involved, he's too clever to bank his ill-gotten gains. Looks that way, and if it isn't him, I'm all out of suggestions. No one else working in that shop throws up any alarm signals, and I've looked into them all. Even so, Davies has dealt with most of the bogus claims, and that can't be a coincidence, can it? I did notice on CCTV that a couple of the people waiting for loans hung back, looking in display cabinets and stuff until Davies was free to serve them. Most people looking for a loan don't have the cash to shop for jewellery and just want to do the transaction as quickly as possible. Then Davies definitely deserves a closer look, Cassie said. Jack sighed. I guess that means I'm going out tonight. Hot date? She asked, sounding a little too casual. Yeah, tailing Davies, and it's frigging freezing out. Don't be such a baby. Put your thermals on and you'll be fine. Where are you headed anyway? No idea. I overheard Davies on his mobile in the break room today, arranging to meet someone at 9 this evening. He ended the call when he heard me coming, so I have no idea where or who. Might just be a girlfriend. Take care on that motorbike. A bike wasn't an attractive option in such Arctic conditions, but it was the best way to get about, and interestingly, a good vehicle on which to tail a person. It was surprising how little notice people took of anonymous bikes. Jack's helmet was a great disguise, the bike nippy in traffic and easy to park. The things I do to earn a crust. Take care and let me know how it goes. Will do. Sighing, Jack took Cassie's advice and pulled on thermals and biking leathers. You had to take the rough with the smooth in this game, but he had no intention of freezing his nuts off if it turned out to be a long wait. He knew where Davies lived and pulled the bike into an alleyway opposite, killing the engine. There was a light on in the front room. Hopefully he wasn't meeting the mystery person in his own place. When the front door opened 20 minutes later, Jack felt vindicated. Davies appeared, climbed into his 10-year-old Vauxhall and drove off without looking to see if anyone was loitering and without seeming the least bit furtive. The lights remained on inside the house, and Jack noticed a figure moving around behind the thin curtains, the mother presumably. Davies's living arrangements were not Jack's concern, but where he was off to now could be. Jack gave him a head start, then fired up the bike and followed a safe distance behind. Davies negotiated his way around Newbury's one-way system and turned off in the direction of Lambourne. Where are you going? Jack muttered to himself. The roads were getting quieter, and it was necessary for Jack to hold back. Fortunately, there were few street lights, and it was easy to keep Davies's tail lights in sight. 9 p.m. was the equivalent of midnight around these parts. People in horse country got up before dawn to see to the animals, so they ran on a different time clock. After about 15 minutes, Davies indicated and pulled into the driveway of a large house. Jack rode on and found a place to stop a bit further on. He doubled back on foot and read the name of the house on the brick gatepost, Smithfield. From the outside lights at the front of the house, it was obvious that it was a big place, but then most of the private houses in this part of the world came with telephone number price tags. It would be easy enough to find out who it belonged to, but why a lowly paid shop assistant would be visiting at this time of night was less clear. Davies left again after 20 minutes, heading back towards Newbury. On a whim, Jack reclaimed his bike and headed for Alexi's cottage. Chances are she would still be up, and if there was no strange cars outside, he'd pay her a surprise call. After all, He could honestly say he'd been in the area. She might even know who owned the house Davies had just visited. Disappointed to find her cottage in darkness and no sign of her car, Jack decided to call it a night. His route home would take him past Hopgood Hall. Might as well drop in for a swift half and listen to Drew wax lyrical about his baby daughter's myriad attributes. Jack smiled as he thought about the christening he'd attended a couple of weeks ago, the last time he'd seen Alexi. He'd seen some proud parents in his time, but Drew and Cheryl were in a class of their own. He envied them their contentment and felt a moment's regret for all that domestic harmony he'd never got to experience. Even when Hopgood Hall was in danger of going under, as far as Jack had been able to tell, Drew and Cheryl never let the financial strain impinge upon their relationship. That was unusual. In his line of work, Jack had seen a good many marriages fold under such pressure. He was glad that Alexi had come up with ideas to help them survive. Jack sensed something was wrong even before he saw all the flashing lights and emergency vehicles blocking the road outside Hopgood Hall. What the? He parked the bike up and covered the rest of the distance on foot. Alexi's distinctive Mini with its garish pink roof was in the car park, and he immediately worried that something might have happened to her, or to Cheryl or Drew. A uniformed constable was standing guard at the main door, and there were all sorts of human comings and goings. He recognised a detective he knew from Reading Nick and, oh hell, the coroner's van. "Can't let you in," the uniform on the door said when Jack tried to walk past him like he owned the place. "Unless you're a resident, of course," he added, consulting a clipboard. "I'm with Ms. Ellis," Jack said. "Oh, she didn't say to—" "Jack!" Alexi ran down the steps and threw her arms around him. "I thought I heard your voice. Am I glad to see you?" "What's happened?" he asked, catching hold of her. "Oh, I figured you must already know." She blinked up at Jack, and he could see she was freaked out, not thinking straight. "Why else would you be here?" Now wasn't the time for his "I was just passing" routine. The stark porch light shone on Alexi's face. It was ghostly white, and she was trembling. Nothing like the tough, independent journalist he'd come to know and admire during the Natalie Parker case. Nothing had seemed to faze her then, not even being almost strangled by the guy who'd killed Natalie. "Tell me," he said, closing his arms protectively around her. "It'll be all right." "Not for one of the contestants in the show it won't," she said, her voice trembling almost as much as her body. "Cheryl called me and I came right over. Got here at the same time as the police." She paused, looking up at Jack through eyes luminous with shock. "She's been murdered." Chapter 3. It's okay. Jack's capable hands spanned Alexi's back and held her firmly against him until she stopped trembling. She closed her eyes and rested her head on his shoulder, aware that things were far from okay. It made her tired just thinking about all the hoops they'd now have to jump through, to say nothing of having a murder on the loose. Even so, having Jack there, a timely arrival he had yet to explain, somehow made it feel as though the whole terrible mess wouldn't spiral completely out of control. God, she was being selfish. A girl had lost her life, and Alexi was thinking about damage control for the hotel. "Let's go inside and you can tell me about it." Jack slid an arm around her waist. He signed the duty copper's clipboard and was allowed past the cordon. Alexi didn't look into the bar where the remaining contestants, a couple of guys from Far Reach Productions, and Marcel were gathered, waiting to be questioned. Instead, she took Jack's hand and led the way to Cheryl's private kitchen. "I was at home," she said, unable to remember if she'd already told him that. "Cheryl called me in a dreadful state, so I came straight over." "You should have called me." "Why?" She shot him a bemused look. "Anyway, it doesn't matter. You're here now. You must have a nose for bad news. We haven't seen much of you for weeks, and then, out of the blue..." Realising that she sounded accusatory, Alexi abruptly shut her mouth. Cheryl and Drew were sitting at the table when they walked into the kitchen. Cheryl looked as shocked as Alexi felt. Drew was trying to comfort her. "Jack, they said together. "What are you doing here?" Cosmo and Toby were in the dog's basket. Cosmo looked up, saw Jack, and made a sound like a cross between a meow and a purr. He leapt with feline grace straight into Jack's arms, and Alexi could have sworn the traitorous beast actually bared his teeth in a smile. Cosmo was at his curmudgeonly best whenever he came to the hotel and found it buzzing with film people, all of whom he'd taken a dislike to. At the producer's request, Cosmo was banned from going anywhere near the annex. Everyone was terrified of him. Juliette had even tried to kick him. Cosmo's reaction to Jack was a much-needed lighter moment in an otherwise fraught evening. "Hey, big guy," he said, rubbing the purring cat's head. "I miss you too." He put Cosmo down, pulled out a chair for Alexi, and took the one next to her. "Believe it or not," Jack said, "I was in the area on another job. I thought I'd call in for a swift half, then saw all the commotions. I had to know what was going on." "We're well and truly screwed, is what's going on," Drew replied despondently. "The star of the show has only gone and been killed. First Natalie Parker connected to us, now this. No one will risk coming here after the news gets out." "Marcel?" Jack shook his head. "But I just saw him." "No, not Marcel. Juliette, the blonde." Jack shook his head. "Just saw her too, in tonight's episode." "That was filmed 2 days ago," Cheryl said. "I sounded a bit harsh just now," Drew said. "Thinking about the hotel when Juliette has lost her life. Ignore me. It's the shock. She wasn't always easy to get along with. Her tantrums on screen weren't just for show. She had tunnel vision with regard to winning the contest and didn't care whose toes she trampled on in order to get herself noticed. It didn't make her popular, but none of us would have wished her dead." "Too right we should think about the hotel," Alexi said, "and call me a cynic or a horrible, heartless..."